the more things change. Webs. The scientist Dr. Jaco Kutzer had been abducted midway through his flight from Johannesburg to London by CIA agents assigned to investigate potential threats and risks to the United States of America. Charles F. Kleiner had been given full control over the investigation into the Micronet brain implant technology. Charles F. Kleiner was, unaffectionately known within intelligence circles as CFC. It was he who had first considered the threat posed to the status quo by the futurologist scientists in the early days of the growth of the technology. CFC was a small, thin, visually insignificant type with a deep, droll, pondering voice and a large pulsating forehead and bead-like eyes that shifted closer together whenever his interest in a matter was stimulated. His skin was white and his complexion spotless. He was 43 years of age at the time of taking on the Micronet project. He wore dark clothes, normally black polo neck jerseys in cashmere or wool, and black trousers that perfectly stopped level to the tips of his shiny black leather shoes. Whenever he shifted from one spot to another, his black silk socks with their bald eagle emblems could be glimpsed as his hemline slipped up and down and then back into position when he stopped moving. He would stand motionless at times, simply staring out of a window into the night. His thoughts were dark and clouded. Not even his bosses were privy to the mechanics of his deceptive mind. He kept his inner self a closely guarded secret. It was difficult to speculate with CFC. His mood followed his dress sense, and he was, to all intents and purposes, a one-dimensional character. The perfect employee for the type of job he did and the type of employer he worked for. His job was to constantly improve the position of the United States of America in relation to any entity likely to pose a threat. A very wide berth of a remit for a man whose mind relished counter-espionage and molesting human rights. He was smart, cruel, clever, ugly, and shrewd all at once, and it was decided a long time ago that this type of individual, with this type of character and this type of personality, should work for his country, but that he should also be kept significantly far away from the nucleus of operations, just in case his unpopular operational style became infectious. The Central Intelligence Agency had had their fill of the convulsive, psychotic type of operative. After the debriefing of Dr. Michael Johnson, CFC and his team had concluded that the scientific pioneers of Micronet brain implant technology presented a sufficient risk to the United States of America because of their invention. CFC and his colleagues viewed the status quo as simply falling into three broad categories: the geo-realist, the religionist, and the futurologists. In all things that happened in global affairs, they looked for a balance between the three groups. If there was no balance between the three, or one of the three appeared to be moving ahead, endangering the existence of the others, then CFC would order an intervention. His interventions would be clinical, cold, and normally result in death or disappearance. In this instance, the futurologists posed a grave threat to the existence of the georealists, those who interpret the world the way it is, and to the religionists, those who see the world and human life as a product of faith, hope and love through prayer and salvation from God. CFC viewed Micronet brain implant technology as something which would wipe away all other perceptions of creation, because it would be living proof that humankind had finally achieved godlike qualities in an earthly form. Micronet brain implant technology would eventually control the earth. CFC wasn't taken to complex thought patterns, and his simple thinking led him to believe he could take the technology for his own country and gain for himself great status in the world of the 21st century. To this end, CFC launched or hatched a plot planned in 3 parts, whereby the doctors responsible for Micronet brain implant technology would be accused by the religionists and the georealists of endangering the first principle, the preservation and survival of the human race above all other creatures or creations on this planet. In furtherance of this, he set the 2 against the 1, and the power of the 2 manifested itself in a court case that culminated in a damning verdict against the creators of Micronet brain implant technology and the confiscation of their research material and results. It was no surprise that the research material found its way to the headquarters of CFC in Bern, Switzerland, where he was based. Then he initiated the second part of his plan, which was to prevent anyone from ever undertaking such research openly again. He enlisted the support of a British political historian who was a self-confessed georealist, William Fleming. Mr. William Fleming gave a vitriolic speech on the great steps outside the then newly created International Court in Luxembourg. The speech was so poignant that it resulted in legislation, the Unlawful Body Enhancement Act 2024. At last, Micronet brain implant technology had been effectively smothered. The final part of his plan was to completely own the technology and to eliminate any scientist causally related to the project. CFC knew exactly who they were from the information taken at the debriefing of Dr. Michael Johnson. He had already destroyed their careers through the court case and the resulting legal prohibition. Now he could conclude the Micronet project by killing them, now that the press and media had turned their attentions away. All the doctors were eliminated apart from one, Dr. Kunda Meninga. Try as he could, CFC could not get agents close enough to Dr. Kunda Meninga whilst the doctor remained in the Kenyan Research Centre. He was safe, but the others were eliminated without delay. He concluded there was still time. He would deal with Dr. Kunda Meninga later. Still, the newly fortified Kenyan Research Centre gave him sleepless nights because it prevented a successful closure to his Micronet project. He instructed 2 operatives to board a 747 jumbo jet taking Dr. Jaco Kutzer to London, England, for an appointment with the barrister Keith Penrose, QC. This they did by using stealth fighter jets. They were to extract Dr. Jaco Kutzer and obtain all the knowledge they could from him. He instructed them to kill the Doctor on completion of their mission and dispose of the body in the middle of the Atlantic, somewhere in the vastness between the Americas and Europe. After this was completed, CFC ordered the brutal slaying of Dr. Jürgen Taljaard and his wife Jalamina in the following year in San Diego, California, USA. Each mission was well executed, and all the information and material came to CFC. He now had another idea. He calculated that if he were to monitor the implantation of suitable subjects that could eventually represent his country in a patriotic way, he would prove himself capable of becoming the head of the very bureau he worked so loyally for. No president would refuse to give a man who had made his country invincible any position he asked for in the administration. He even toyed with visions of himself sitting in the Oval Office, flanked by subordinates. CFC flew to Chile in South America, where he recruited 3 scientists who, because of their backgrounds, had become mercenaries in their respective fields. They were rogue doctors whose services depended on top dollar, not morality. They became known as the 3 caustic doctors. These scientists were recruited to continue the Micronet brain implant experimentation through to completion of the final prototype product and the community network. CFC recruited Dr. Felipe Zé González from Brazil, who, but for his father, Professor Gert von Moll, who worked for the Nazi Party during the Second World War, would have been a reputable and well-respected scientist. At the end of the Second World War, his father fled to America and then to Brazil, changed his name and bought respectability and reputation with the Hebrew gold he had taken with him. Dr. Felipe Zé González was a kind man in his youth, but now turned cold as his father's sinister past unfurled itself before him. Dr. Felipe Zé González eventually came to the realization that his future was set in stone. As a young man, full of promise, he married beautiful Margarita of the wealthy da Silva family of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and they had a son who they named Felix and a daughter, Ariane. The second, Dr. Giselle d'Estaing, an old French Gaullist living in Chile since the betrayal of his country under President Charles de Gaulle, and finally, Dr. Aaron Scrimmuger, an American scientist with serious white supremacist tendencies that once led him to poison the water supply to a small peace-loving African-American community in Arkansas, USA. Vermin. The 3 were placed in charge of a research centre hidden away deep in one of the dense Mexican jungles, abutting the frontier to the South Americas. CFC arranged funding for the project, equipment and everything the doctors could possibly need. Only Dr. Felipe Zé González was married, and he was required to bring his wife Margarita Zé González da Silva with him to the research centre. Their children, Felix and Ariane, were born within the grounds of the research centre. Once he had fulfilled the task, CFC flew out of South America back to Bern in Switzerland to blend back into the crowds. Within a year, the doctors ran into serious problems. Their subjects had to be of a certain age, between 150 to 540 days old. A rigid rule per Dr. Jürgen Taljaard's essay, The Creation of Regenerative Brain Cells. As a result, they had to employ local militia, skin traders to abduct babies from the local villages, However, this was too risky, and eventually sorties were sent out far and wide across the central and southern regions of the Americas to collect babies for Micronet brain implant experiments. Parents were offered money, anything, in exchange for their babies. All were deceived, and some even had their babies stolen or forcibly taken from them. It happened that the baby slave traders found themselves in a poor, destitute town called Iranto in Brazil, near the capital, Rio de Janeiro. There they learnt of a street child by the name of Meralda de Mendoza, who herself was with child and awfully close to giving birth. They watched her every move as she went through the final term of her pregnancy. At the very moment that Meralda gave birth and the umbilical cord was cut, they pounced, brandishing guns and knives. They demanded the baby in return for sparing the life of the mother and all those in attendance. It was a high-priced strategy, and yet still they escaped with the baby in a bundle. However, not before tragedy struck. The midwife, Maria de Livio, was completely distraught at what was about to happen because she had just delivered a miracle and had had no time to disclose the nature of the miracle to Meralda or Pablo. To Maria, for this to occur now was a great tragedy. Defiance arose in her heart, and she refused to let the baby slave traders take from her the bundle with the newborn wrapped in it. Then one of the traders, the cruelest, Bradetho Blanca, drew his blade and placed it under Maria's chin. Then swiftly, before she or anyone else could react, he drew it hard, deep, and sharply across Maria de Livio's throat, so that her blood spurt out before the group gathered there. Some of her blood was spilt over the bundle with the newborn in it. She fell to the ground, dead in a pool of blood, dying with her secret undisclosed. All the street children backed away, for it was a dreadful sight, and yet nobody had carried a weapon, thinking it to be unfitting at a birth. The baby slave traders left with the blood-splattered bundle with the newborn in it. As they entered their van, they heard two distinct screams from the bundle. As they peeled open the toweled layers of the bundle, to their amazement, they beheld two babies, attached at the side of the head to one another. Bradetho was well pleased, double money, he thought, and he grinned at his luck. But another of the traders, Ernesto Oreja, screamed out in surprise. Seeing this caused him to repent, considering to himself that an even greater sin had been committed against Meralda and indeed God. A madness took him, and he strove aggressively against the others to take the baby back. But whilst he struggled with the others, Bradetho Blanca calmly drew from the thick leather belt about his waist a cold, polished grey pistol. The van rocked from side to side as Ernesto struggled with the others. Bradetho slowly placed the pistol at the side of Ernesto's temple, a centimetre from Ernesto's sweat-drenched forehead. As Ernesto struggled ferociously with the other militiamen for the return of the babies, Bradetho pulled the trigger, blasting Ernesto's brains out onto the floor of the van. The back door of the van was opened, and the body was unceremoniously kicked out into the streets of Oranto for the dogs and vermin to feast upon. Meralda screamed like no mother could ever have screamed at the loss of her baby. The midwife had died without being able to tell Meralda that she had twins, a boy and a girl. Pablo stood stone-faced. He gritted his teeth and looked at his friend Dunga. They both felt emotion well up inside them, and they left that place without a word and went to their home and got their guns and machetes and began to hunt the baby slave traders on foot. Pablo swore that he would kill the slave traders and every one of their paymasters as and when he found them. Dunga stood by and heard the oath of his friend and swore that he would see that it came to pass. Many months passed, and eventually the twins were separated and named. The boy they called Method and the girl Sylph. The doctors noticed how Method said nothing, but Sylph found it easy to communicate with him. At 11 months, along with other primed babies, the doctors performed the Micronet brain implant surgery. Most of the subjects were Brazilian street children. Sadly, a significant number of the experiments were serious failures. The bodies needed to be disposed of without trace. The doctors contacted CFC for him to carry out the disposal, but CFC had been reassigned by his bosses at Langley. The doctors wanted CFC to arrange for the delivery of large vats full to the brim with hydrochloric acid that would be used to dissolve the flesh and the bones completely. CFC announced to the doctors that because of the Unlawful Body Enhancement Act, all funding had been suspended to this project and that he was unable to provide short-term funding to them whilst the law was being observed by his employers. Because of the change in the direction of the agency, CFC's paymasters had decided that the Micronet project, as undertaken by CFC, itself represented a threat to American credibility, and that it should be halted right away. CFC said nothing of this to the doctors. Instead, he promised them that after the excitement over enforcement of this new law had blown over, he would be able to resume funding to the Micronet project. In fact, CFC lied, and funding was never resumed. CFC conveniently washed his hands of the whole sordid affair, for the time being, and blended back into the Swiss community. The doctors never saw or heard from CFC again. The doctors had to do something to continue their experiments because they were now fully aware of the future value of a successful outcome to the Micronet brain implant technology experiments on human beings. Their conundrum was the inability to synchronize the Micronet brain implant with the conventional internet. They sought funding by advertising in code over the internet for sponsors. They were ultra careful not to disclose the full nature of their works. Emotion. A young Diana was surfing the internet using her me-ability when she came across an article written by the doctors. Diana was instantly captivated by their research. Eduardo Tapp had told her that it was unlikely that she would ever meet anyone with similar abilities to hers during her lifetime. Diana couldn't accept that this was the case, and she regularly surfed the internet looking for information that would lead her to the answers that clouded her mind. Answers about her parents and why she was the way she was. To find an article about 3 doctors doing research into nanotechnology was uncanny, especially as the doctors drafted the article in a way that only genuinely interested readers would continue reading and get the sense that the doctors were searching for patrons to help continue their research. On another occasion, while surfing the internet, Diana came across more old newspaper publications concerning her natural parents, Jürgen and Jalomina Taljard, a Dr. Jaco Kutzer and a Dr. Kunda Meninga, regarding an important trial at the International Court in Luxembourg, which eventually led to the Unlawful Body Enhancement Act. Even though Diana was wise beyond her years and had excellent understanding, the complexities of the issues raised in the newspaper article and the Unlawful Body Enhancement Act were beyond her comprehension. She stored the information and waited until a time when she mastered the power within herself to understand. That time was not far off. The Micronet brain implant had begun to meld deeper and deeper links with her brain stem, making her smarter and smarter. Her me would eventually give her the ability to form logic and comprehension in nanoseconds. Still, Diana was fascinated by the information she was able to retrieve from the net. She now knew that her parents had other acquaintances that were intricately connected and that all of them had Micronet brain implant technology in common. Even as she tried to separate her emotion from the reasoning in her mind, Diana was unable to come to terms with the brutal slaying of her parents. She would brood in a dark corner of the yard where they lived, in a place where the sun found it hard to shine, and her mind could be left alone to be clouded with sorrow, despair, and egregious loss. Eduardo would speak to Diana often regarding God and the strength of prayer, and Diana would strive with her will to control the rages that welled up inside her, until finally, unable to rid herself of despair, she learnt instead to conceal her unhappiness from everyone else but Eduardo. At times she would seek out Eduardo and ask him for guidance. But Eduardo was a man of faith and not a scientist. How could he guide his powerful foster daughter in the ways of the world outside of gardening or the Mexican village of Esperanto? To this end, Eduardo was oblivious. Often Eduardo would beg Diana not to let her sadness grow into a mental cancer that would destroy her future. Diana, mi hija, always I tell you that God is good, and you should know, for your parents have given you the gift of invincibility and long, long life, and more gifts that not even I or even you know of yet. How can you give hate a home in your heart? You should be contented and ready to embrace humanity, hija, advised Eduardo. Papa, I am happy when I see you, but to embrace humanity, Papa, I know I am young, but my ability helps me to see far and wide. And I must tell you that even though I try so extremely hard, I cannot accept that han muerto mis propios padres so easily, and before I even knew them. I wish I never had this ability, because my ignorance is cut short, and as each day passes I understand more, and I want justice for my parents' killers. Is that too mucho, Papa? Para pedir? Merely to ask for, replied Diana. Diana, there are some powerful people in this world, and tough as it is to accept, it is because your parents stumbled into the paths of powerful people that they are no longer here. It was no fault of yours or theirs. Little words of comfort I can give you, because that is the worst of sorrows, and if I could, mi chiquita, Diana, I would bear that sorrow for you, to spare your heart from corruption, responded Eduardo. Papa, there is no need because the pain has cut too deep. Papa, I have no fear of powerful people and their dark ways. Yes, I believe in our God, and each day I pray for help to get me to understand the good in humankind. But there is none, Papa. No good. None I can find in what was done to my parents. Treated like they were nothing, and their work stolen. Papa, if you did not take care of me, I would have been dead too. I am no longer Talshad, for that name cannot exist. Should I just forgive them and forget them? Demanded Diana. Diana, you cannot ask me that. You must ask God. I love you more than anything left to me in this world. God gave me the strength to love you, to cherish you and to raise you in His sight. Now you have understanding. You must go back to God, for He is your true Father now, said Eduardo. Papa, will you leave me to my enemies? Will you not be with me through my troubles? I need your help, your guidance, and your love, which is still so very precious to me, pleaded Diana. Eduardo relinquished. Why, Diana? Why do you ask? You know there is no end to the love I have for you. He answered, because I will repay all those who stole my parents from me, robbed me of the time with my natural parents for money. And if it be the world, dearest Papa, then it is that which I will demand as full compensation for my loss. I will take my vengeance as I see fitting. Will you not stand with me, Papa, to avenge the death of good people whom you too also loved? Asked Diana. As I stood by your father and mother in their hour of need, I will also stand with you, young Diana, my daughter. This was all Eduardo could say. He loved his adopted daughter and was prepared to die for her. Plans. 5 years passed, and Diana Tapp was now a 21st century whiz kid. Finally arranged a meeting with the 3 doctors to discuss their article. Diana was beginning to develop into a shrewd and wise young businesswoman. Recently, she had set up Tapp Security Systems Limited. Within 3 years, it became the Tapp Consortium, offices Canary Wharf, London, England, where she and Eduardo now lived. One of her brainchild ideas. The Tapp Consortium was destined to become a powerful company in the corporate world. She did this with the help of Eduardo. As the mental ability of Diana increased, she devised many ways to put her skills to lucrative use. Ever, the watchful eye of Eduardo Tapp was on Diana, and anyone who came too close to her or asked too many questions about Diana's ability would be stared at intensely, which was very unnerving because Eduardo was a man of God. They soon came to realise not to ask too much or to pry too deeply into Diana's affairs. Eduardo made sure Diana was discreet, because he knew that whoever killed her parents would immediately come after her if they knew that she existed. Business was conducted through third parties. Carefulness was ever the watchword. Eduardo would say, cuidado, be careful, so often that instinctively Diana would think, cuidado, before embarking on any new business venture. The registered chief executive officer of the Tapp Consortium was Eduardo Tapp. Eduardo held the chairmanship because Diana was too young to be the head of a corporate entity. At this time, Diana instructed Eduardo to recruit a team of directors headed up by the brilliant and mercurial Carl Schlesinger, a recent recruitee to the fold. Diana had chosen Carl Schlesinger and a team of Mr. Schlesinger's choice to visit the three caustic doctors, as they were now known locally in Mexico. Their mission was to secure the doctor's services for the Tapp Consortium. This was dependent on Diana being able to get a waiver from certain sections of the Unlawful Body Enhancement Act that would allow the Tapp Consortium to carry out Micronet brain implant research and regulated experiments, an exceedingly difficult task indeed, considering the foundation of human emotion supporting the force of this legislation, but commercially confident Diana promised to do this. At the briefing before the scheduled meeting in Mexico, Carl Schlesinger harboured several reservations about the backgrounds of the three doctors. He raised them with his boss, just to make sure everything was clear in his understanding of the objective of this mission. Miss Tapp, have you read the background on these doctors? Asked Carl Schlesinger. Eduardo intervened before Diana Tapp could respond to Carl Schlesinger. Mr. Schlesinger, Miss Tapp, you will find is very thorough. I ain't saying Miss Tapp isn't, but these doctors are not the savouryest types. Well, let's just put it like this. They are not the type of doctors I would trust to remove my appendix, if I still had them, of course. Do you get my meaning? Mr. Schlesinger, for the type of project we are contemplating embarking on, Eduardo was interrupted. Diana felt it was now time for her to address the briefing meeting directly. She politely interrupted Eduardo. Excuse me, Papa, but I believe Mr. Schlesinger requires a fuller answer to complement the type of intellectualism which he is capable of, and if I may add, one of the primary reasons for his appointment at the Tapp Consortium. Carl was slightly surprised at the ease at which his youthful employer spoke. Well, thank you, Miss Tapp, he said. Carl Schlesinger became more informal and polite. Not at all, Carl. May I call you Carl? The only person I permit myself to be formal with is my papa, Eduardo. You may call me Diana. Makes for a more productive business relationship, don't you think? Of course, of course. Now, Carl, what would you like to know about this project? Oh, yes. And I would like to employ your services, if you don't mind, that is, for another field project on your return. As it stands, the success of that project will allow us to proceed to culmination with this project, explained Diana. Carl Schlesinger took a deep breath, whilst preparing the myriad of questions jumbled up in his mind. At that moment he realised he didn't really understand what the business of his employer was. He knew that they provided high-tech security equipment and got paid well for it, but that was all. When he had prepared a few questions, he began. Obviously, the doctors have politically incorrect pasts. Bearing this in mind, for a company as reputable as ours, what do the doctors have in common with us that makes them so valuable to us? Asked Carl Schlesinger. Good question, Carl. A single thread binds the doctors to the Tapp Consortium. Micronet brain implant technology. What is that? Schlesinger's mental list of questions evaporated. Diana's answer knocked his mind for six. He thought to himself, what would this kid be doing with such big words? Doesn't she know that they will give her nightmares? He composed himself and awaited her reply. Diana began. In the first quarter of this century, there were a select team of scientists working on a project. For convenience, we will call it the Micronet project. The project was based on theoretical essays drafted by the country's finest scientific minds. Around 2025, those scientists responsible for pioneering the technology mysteriously disappeared or were tragically killed. In later years, their disappearance and deaths were questioned, but at the time only a few were surprised or raised eyebrows at the proximity of the tragedies surrounding those scientists. It has come to the knowledge of the Tapp Consortium that those scientists' work remained intact, and we believe it was passed to others to continue. Those three unsavoury types, as you refer to, remember those are your words, not mine, were chosen by the new owners of the technology, whom we do not yet have any information regarding, to carry out experiments and bring the technology to final fruition. Unfortunately, because of the Unlawful Body Enhancement Act, of which you are already aware, the doctors were unable to properly carry out the experiments, disposal being the main problem, I believe. However, we at the Tapp Consortium, after our research and investigation into the Micronet project, have decided that the doctors' predicament comes clearly under one of our long-term aims, which is still a secret, or as they say, on a need-to-know basis. However, what the doctors are doing clearly affects our future business plans, and as we have the technical and commercial acumen to facilitate the doctors, and they have the scientific ability to carry out very specific experiments for the Tapp Consortium, I believe you and a team of well-versed negotiators should meet with the doctors and close a deal that will ultimately guarantee us their services. Not their political or ethical persuasions, mind you. No, just their professional services on a long-term basis. Is that all clear now, Carl? Get in there, Diana. Get in there. Good. Any questions? Diana saw that Carl Schlesinger was still thinking, so she carried on. I want you to find out from the doctors what prevents them from completing their experiments, the state of their experiment at the moment, and their long-term availability. That is, how much do they want? And one last thing, Carl. Find out who sanctioned the initial project. Get as much detail about this as possible. Is it clear now, Carl? Yes, Diana, pretty clear, even though I don't mind admitting to you that I have 1,001 questions to ask you, mainly concerning this Micronet project. Yes, but if I tell you too much about the particular project now, it may prejudice your views later when things become even more interesting. And I would so much like for you to have a clear head when you deal with the three doctors. Remember our job. We are business people. We do not express our opinions in a subjective way. We are objective. And always, Carl, always in the needs of the business. If you stick with this course of action, as time goes by, you will fully understand the direction of the Tapp Consortium and eventually come to appreciate the consortium for its ability to protect you when you leave the confines of our abode on business matters. Oh, and one final thing. It is especially important to establish in detail the status of the Micronet project. This information will particularly benefit you regarding the project you will embark upon on your return. That is, if my mind serves me correctly about world affairs. Okay, Diana, I will. Carl, good luck. This is your first big assignment with the consortium. We wish you well. The plane leaves for Mexico City in 3 hours, said Eduardo Tapp. Carl Schlesinger grabbed the tickets as Eduardo held them out to him. He looked at the other 2 members of his team, asked them if they needed anything. They said no, and they made their way through the door to the awaiting car to whisk them to Heathrow Airport to board the 11:45 in the morning British Airways flight BA 045 to Mexico City, Mexico. Assignment. The jumbo jet arrived in Mexico City at 15:55 hours local time. The flight was run of the mill, and Carl Schlesinger and his team, Siobhan Clark and Danny Kramer, forced themselves to sleep most of the 10-hour flight so that the effects of jet lag could easily be gotten out of their systems before they met the 3 doctors. As always, Carl Schlesinger relished field projects, face to face with the opponent, nothing but wit and intellectual grit separating his opponent from him, and Carl Schlesinger was full of wit and intellectual grit, born and raised in Queens, New York, another reason for his appointment to the post of Director of Security and Operations. From Mexico City Airport, they took a cab for 4 miles to a taberna on the north side of hot, humid and sticky Mexico City. The area was heavily populated with Mexicans of European descent. The inhabitants of the northern side were visibly taller than the indigenous Mexican population. They spoke fluent Spanish and behaved in a very Central American aristocratic manner. Wealth stealthily took its place amongst these people. Expensive cars, beautiful tiendas, haciendas, belitha, and tall, stylish, well-maintained senoras walked slowly, gracefully up and down La Grande Parade, the main street. The senoras shielded from the warm Mexican sun with 5-inch rim designer hats that matched the colours of their dresses, lipstick and handbags, all Gucci, Bettini, Versace, Prada, Coach, Gianfranco Ferré. The smells of expensive cologne and perfume floated through the thick, humid air, causing an intoxication of sensuality that set the scene for romance and sexual pleasure by night. Siobhan Clark's eyes began to wander. The sight was encapsulating, and she began to glide into the mysticism of an early seductive Mexican evening as handsome gentlemen gently returned her glances as they glided past her. Carl Schlesinger noticed her nonchalance and called to Siobhan in an abrupt manner. He did the same to Danny just in case the erotic mist fell upon him too. He bade both be on the lookout for a taberna by the name of Labios Linda. Danny Kramer spotted the taberna on the second block on the left of the main street, La Grande Parade. Carl immediately checked his watch. They were 45 minutes early. Carl estimated that another 10 minutes would be used up walking to the taberna, ordering drinks and finding seats in Labios Linda. Thus real time was 20 minutes tops. 28 minutes later they were sitting sipping distilled mineral water, ice with a slice of Mexican lime. They sipped slowly and looked around the taberna. The bar was set in the centre. It was shaped like a triangle. The main liquor on the shelves was tequila, rum and whiskey. They were able to see across to their left and then to their right and straight ahead. With a swivel of their chairs they could see behind themselves. The bar had pretty much been cased, concluded Carl Schlesinger. 7 minutes remained. Outside Labios Linda the blue sky and rolling greyish-white clouds were still visible in the sky as the sun began to set high in the west. The taberna was well presented with walnut-finished furniture and polished brass fittings. The taberna had an old-fashioned saloon door. One of the slats on the left swinging door was missing. A pair of little eyes belonging to a local kid peered through into the world of grown-ups at play. Overall, the taberna was a decent place, judging by the well-heeled types that attended the bar. They took their drinks to a low table by the pool that was situated at the rear of the building. The people of this place were the original proponents of the popular adage, "Good things come to those who wait." Their forebears mostly lived through the dark ages of European 20th century politics and decided to leave the old world for the Americas. Carl Schlesinger looked at his watch again. 2 minutes to the time. He hadn't noticed anyone yet. He began to fidget. This was unusual for Carl Schlesinger. He held the face of his watch between finger and thumb and slowly rotated it back and forth around his wrist while slowly looking from side to side to avoid too much attention. Siobhan and Danny were secretly pleased that at last their boss showed some emotion. They were beginning to think that he was a clone. Then at 7 o'clock on the dot, 5 men walked through the entrance to the Taberna Labios Linda and made their way through the main bar area to the seating area at the poolside. At the arched entrance to the poolside, 2 of the men, the burliest, stopped like sentinels, positioning themselves like additional gates at the entrance. They were to all intents and purposes bodyguards, doing nothing in their body language to cause an alternative conclusion. They wore dark shades and dressed in khaki cream 2-piece suits with desert brown Clark shoes. They were both beefy, standing 6 foot each, 8 inches each in height. Carl Schlesinger quickly scrutinized them, then turned his attentions to the 3 men who they were guarding. The 3 men walked slowly but definitely in the direction of the 3 representatives of the Tapp Consortium. The first to arrive at the table were Carl, Siobhan and Danny sat was Dr. Felipe Z. Gonzalez. He introduced himself as such and inquired of their identity to the identity of the 3 they each reciprocated in sequence. The second, Dr. Giselle D'Estaing, introduced himself, next followed up by Dr. Aaron Scrimmuger. They sat and ordered salt-rimmed tequilas with water, ice and slices of lemon and lime. Once they had calmed themselves through small conversation and the usual unprofessional eyeballing of each other, they felt, all of them, sufficiently reassured to begin. Carl Schlesinger opened the conversation. Dr. Aaron Scrimmuger, it is a pleasure to be in your presence and to be sharing such an important part of our company's business with you. Thank you, Mr. Schlesinger. But if you knew me, which I suspect you do, you would not really mean what you have just said, unless of course you are of the same stable as me, and I doubt that. So I believe you're welcome to be spurious of nothing and inconsequential. Please, Mr. Schlesinger, let us not mix objectives. You want our knowledge and expertise. We want your protection, services, and an attractive remuneration package. Is that correct? Carl Schlesinger wasn't fazed. He knew the 3 doctors were like porcupines, so he had to say something to bring their individual personalities out from under their prickly surfaces. He knew that they would be caustic, but because of the potential offer on the table, it was unlikely. He thought that he would offend them too much. Dr. Aaron Scrimmuger looked caustic enough. He was small and meanly looking, with a round body and bulking stomach. His head was big and odd looking, stuck onto such an out-of-shape body. His eyes were set back in his head. The pupils were blue, but the whites were bloodshot, with a million tiny veins cracking through the whites of his eyes. He looked troubled and cursed. His mouth was tight and his lips thin. He had no hair, and the top of his head was burnt brown, and it shone out of place with his rustic reddish skin appearance. His forehead took up 4/5 of his face, leaving little room to squeeze on his small features like nose, ears and cheeks. Dr. Aaron Scrimger had no discernible smile. He had forfeited that years ago when he was charged for attempted genocide. He wore a dusty sky blue summer suit with light blue slip-ons on his feet. In one hand he held a purple pen which he waved around as he spoke, and in the other he held his glass of tequila. He took intermittent sips when he paused between talking. He seemed impatient and irritable, like a man who finds no peace neither during the day or by night, and it was clear that he was so. Carl Schlesinger continued. "Yes, quite, guys, but didn't mean to overdo the ego," he said as he grinned, trying to reduce his opening line to a joke. The three doctors' faces remained expressionless. Schlesinger thought to himself, all those years staring at laboratory mice that didn't smile back caused their lack of emotion. He turned to Siobhan. She was closely scrutinising the doctor's body language, and to her surprise they hadn't really been upset. It was as if they needed the consortium more than the consortium needed them, and they were willing to forego the odd, idiotic or derogatory statement to achieve their objectives. She managed to convey her findings to Carl by lifting her eyebrows and cocking her head ever so gently to the left. Carl blinked to acknowledge her message. Danny sat watching their hands. Any sudden shifts or twitches would be reported to Carl with a gentle nodding of the head to the right. Carl began again. He cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, my employer would like to know exactly what the status of your research is, and based on this has instructed us to negotiate acceptable compensation for your long-term services. Is this acceptable so far?" Dr. Felipe Zé González nodded and replied in a Brazilian accent, "Yes, Mr. Schlesinger." Dr. Felipe Zé González was taller than the other two. He had a Brazilian aristocratic flair about him, with his dark, curly hair mopping his Jesus-shaped forehead. He had a moustache and beard, both mildly kempt, but his breeding gave the appearance that his facial hairstyle suited him enormously. His long neck sat on a sturdy pair of shoulders. He wore a light brown blazer with a white cotton shirt underneath, with the 3 lower buttons fastened, allowing his curly chest hair to be revealed. He scratched at this with his hairy, well-manicured fingers, and as he sat with his legs crossed right to left in the direction of the Tapp Consortium team, with his other hand he gently rubbed the soft lobes of his left ear. His forehead produced frequent wrinkles, then none, then wrinkles again, as he frowned at the verbatim of Carl Schlesinger, slowly trying to read between the lines. His eyes were deep brown, and they opened and closed as he blinked. His eyes were set far back into his head, giving the appearance of 2 impenetrable shadows. His bushy eyebrows protected them from the sunlight. Dr. Felipe Zé González slowly looked up and down Siobhan Clark's legs and wondered what she would be like in the sack. "Gentlemen, my employer would like to know exactly what the status of your research is, and based on this has instructed us to negotiate acceptable compensation for your long-term services. Is this acceptable so far? Dr. Felipe Z. Gonzalez turned again to Carl Schlesinger. Mr. Schlesinger, we have two problems. Your employer is aware of the first. It is highly technical. Explanation we believe is wasted upon you. The second problem we have been working on a project that involves placing tiny Micronet brain implants into the brains of young babies.